Opening the door for the queen and bishop immediately sets up dynamic attacking possibilities. Unfurling the Sicilian defense, black immediately contests central space and prepares a dynamic queenside counterplay. Securing the center and preparing kingside castling, this natural developing square immediately challenges black's central grip. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential F6, this move creates a dynamic pawn structure that promises rich strategic possibilities. Opens a diagonal for the bishop, subtly reinforcing central control and preparing a flexible pawn structure. Developing a piece to its natural square, consolidates the center and prepares for further pawn breaks. Preparing a kingside fianchetto, this pawn push signals a long-term strategic vision to control the h1a8 diagonal and potentially pressure black's queenside. Preparing for a fianchetto, black aims to control the long diagonal, a sensible response to white's developing kingside pawn structure. Perfectly angles the bishop to eye the kingside, a classic Sicilian setup, preparing to castle and solidify control. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal solidifies black's kingside control and prepares for a potential central pawn break later on. Securing the king behind a pawn fortress immediately begins the process of preparing pieces for a central struggle, aligning the bishop on the long diagonal and hinting at future pawn breaks. Solidifying the pawn center with e5 immediately challenges white's central control and creates a more locked position, potentially leading to positional maneuvering rather than immediate sharp tactics. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential queenside expansion with b4, this offers a flexible approach to the game's developing tension without committing prematurely. Developing the knight to e7 cleverly supports a potential pawn push on d5 while simultaneously freeing up the f8 bishop, preparing for future queenside expansion and reinforcing the central pawn chain without immediately committing to aggressive action. This knight's jump to the rim, though unusual, aims to exploit a potential weakness on black's kingside, perhaps preparing a subsequent f4 push or looking to exchange off black's fianchettoed bishop. Consider the long-term consequences for king's safety if black finds a way to open the center or attack this exposed knight. Castling now shores up your king's safety, a wise decision as white's knight menacingly eyes the kingside, preparing to infiltrate. Unleashing a pawn storm that aims to fracture black's central pawn chain and create immediate attacking potential on the kingside, this move dramatically intensifies the struggle for space. The immediate capture on f4 fundamentally alters the central pawn structure, opening the f-file for potential piece activity, but also creating a lasting pawn weakness on e5 for white that black must exploit before the knight returns to defend. Opening up the g-file for your rook creates immediate attacking potential, but be mindful of the potential weaknesses this creates around your king, as black's pieces often find ways to exploit such imbalances. Embracing tactical complexity, this pawn push aims to disrupt white's central grip, injecting dynamism into the position by immediately challenging the knight. It opens lines for black's pieces, especially the queen, and potentially creates attacking chances on the kingside. However, it does weaken the e5 pawn and could lead to a sharp, double-edged game where precise calculation is paramount to avoid falling into traps. Reclaiming central influence, the knight embarks on a journey to d2, a less direct but often more robust path than immediate central deployment, aiming to bolster the d-pawn and perhaps prepare a later kingside advance or a subtle repositioning towards the queenside. Stepping the king back to h8 is a prudent defensive maneuver, creating a safe haven from the potential storm brewing on the kingside, especially with white's g-file pawn openly exposed. Realigning the knight to this central square signals a renewed push on the kingside, aiming to bolster the attack and potentially exploit the now open g-file that was created by black's recent pawn captures. Initiating a pawn exchange here, black actively seeks to destabilize the pawn structure white has meticulously built, potentially opening lines for counterplay. This capture, though seemingly simple, directly challenges white's central control and creates a dynamic situation where white must carefully consider how to reinvest their advantage, whether by recapturing immediately to maintain material balance or by using the freed-up pawns to further advance their pieces. Opening the d-file with this capture immediately grants your pieces access to central territory and begins to pressure Black's king's defenses, creating a dynamic battleground where piece activity will dictate the outcome. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, Black challenges White's cramped king position and aims to break open the position while simultaneously creating counterplay on the d-file. Opening up the center with that capture immediately challenges Black's central pawn and aims to exploit the newly created diagonal for your bishop. Unleashing the queen into the center after recapturing instantly heightens the battle's intensity, seeking to exploit the slightly uncoordinated white pieces and the king's potential exposure. Trading queens here drastically simplifies the position, potentially leading to an endgame where Black's queenside majority might offer winning chances if White isn't careful with pawn structure. The knight immediately repositions to the center, reclaiming lost central influence after White's queen trade. This recapture is a logical reaction, aiming to activate the piece and contest the d-file, a crucial central corridor. Black needs to ensure their pieces are well coordinated, especially with White's pawn structure on the kingside potentially offering attacking avenues. By centralizing the knight, Black prepares to potentially support pawn breaks or harass White's pieces. The game is entering a phase where piece placement and pawn structure will dictate the initiative, and this knight's placement is a key step in building Black's counterplay. Unleashing a knight from its protective pawn shield, White aims to disrupt Black's central stability and potentially threaten the king's dominion, carving out a new avenue of attack on the kingside. Disengaging the knight from the central skirmish allows it to redeploy, seeking influence on the queenside and potentially supporting a pawn advance or pressuring White's now exposed d-pawn. Targeting that isolated d-pawn is a solid positional goal, subtly pressuring a key weakness in Black's structure and forcing them to constantly defend, all while developing your bishop to a more active diagonal. Black's knight repositions aggressively, eyeing the now undefended c3 square and aiming to disrupt White's carefully constructed queenside pawn structure, a bold attempt to inject dynamism into an otherwise somewhat static position and challenge White's central control. Consolidating the rook's influence on the central file solidifies White's control, preparing for potential advances or defensive maneuvers along the open e-file. Initiating a more active role for the bishop, Black seeks to bolster the light square structure and potentially prepare for a queenside expansion with this development. Repositioning the bishop to c1 opens a crucial diagonal for the queen's rook and prepares to contest the c-file, an often vital pathway in Sicilian structures where Black's pawn on d6 creates a slight structural weakness. Instead of passively defending the d5 pawn, Black aggressively challenges White's center and aims to activate the bishop, potentially targeting the weakened dark squares around White's king. A strategic redeployment begins, rerouting the knight to potentially influence the queenside or to reinforce the center if the opportunity arises, while also freeing up its original square for other pieces. The knight's journey to f5 suddenly injects a welcome dose of activity into Black's position, aiming to contest the crucial central squares and potentially disrupt White's pawn structure by attacking the d3 pawn. Reclaiming the initiative with knight repositioning, this maneuver aims to disrupt Black's nascent queenside pressure and open lines for White's own pieces, potentially leading to a more active pawn structure. The knight's repositioning to e7 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure, potentially preparing for future pawn advances or solidifying defense against White's active pieces. Reclaiming the initiative, this knight maneuver seeks to disrupt Black's developing pieces and exploit the open central files, potentially creating new attacking avenues for White's rooks and queen. Unleashing the bishop to h4 aims to disrupt White's central influence, but it surrenders crucial squares around Black's king, leaving it exposed to potential pawn storms or piece incursions along the newly opened diagonals. The rook ventures to the d-file, immediately challenging Black's queen's control and threatening to pry open lines for a central attack. Asserting pressure along the c-file, this maneuver aims to disrupt White's carefully constructed pawn structure and potentially create infiltration opportunities for the black rooks. A bold push to dislodge the black knight, opening a potential path for the rook and aiming to exploit any weakness on the d-file. Shifting the rook to c7 prepares to contest the open c-file, potentially forcing a trade or establishing pressure on the d-pawn if white commits their pieces further. Suddenly, the knight on b5 lunges forward, aiming to disrupt black's queenside harmony and potentially exploit the now weakened c7 square. Reasserting control over the central column, the rook on c8 prepares for a potential skirmish on the c-file, seeking to disrupt white's recent gains in space and potentially create counterplay against the isolated pawn on d3 if white isn't careful. Targeting that vulnerable knight on a7 with the bishop opens up fascinating possibilities for controlling open files and initiating an attack. Suddenly, the black rook leaps into the fray, a daring foray into enemy territory aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed fortress and exploit the exposed monarch. Retrieving the knight from its aggressive, albeit isolated, outpost on a7 to a more centralized square, seeking to join the defensive effort or prepare for a more robust counterplay. Instantly repositioning the rook to an active file, aiming to exert pressure along the fifth rank and potentially threaten advances into white's territory. This maneuver contests control of the open file and prepares for future pawn pushes or piece activations. Challenging the pawn chain directly, this move seeks to disrupt black's central control and potentially open lines for white's pieces, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of the knight on a4 and the bishop on f6. Boldly repositioning the knight towards the queen side, nb6 aims to contest the open c-file and offer support for future pawn advances, potentially creating counterplay against white's pawn structure while seeking a more active outpost. Reasserting the knight's presence on the central squares, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially prepare a more active role for white's queenside forces, forcing a re-evaluation of black's pawn structure and piece placement. Exploring the potential of the queenside, black repositions the knight to a more active square, eyeing potential incursions and supporting future pawn advances. Flipping the script on piece activity, white boldly repositions the knight, aiming to disrupt black's currently well-coordinated blockade by re-challenging the file's open access and potentially setting up future pressure on the queenside, creating a dynamic shift where static defense suddenly faces renewed offensive intentions. The knight's reluctant dance back to b6, after a brief foray to a7, signifies a tactical impasse, a positional purgatory where neither side can force a decisive breakthrough. Black's pieces remain somewhat cramped, but the threat of the knight finding an active square on c4 or a5 in the future provides a glimmer of hope, preventing white from consolidating a decisive advantage. A surprising retreat, abandoning the central file control gained just moments ago, and offering black another opportunity to solidify their queenside presence. The bishop retreats to a safe square, but it feels like a temporary respite rather than a solution to the positional bind black finds himself in. White's knight on a3 now eyes the weak b5 square and aims to infiltrate further, while the nc3 controls important central squares. Black's pieces are somewhat uncoordinated, with the knight on b6 awkwardly placed and the king still a bit exposed. The challenge for black is to find active counterplay before white consolidates and squeezes the position further. Reactivating the rook to the central file offers a proactive stance, aiming to disrupt black's nascent piece coordination and exploit potential weaknesses around the kingside, even if it seems like a simple repositioning at first glance. The knight's daring foray to the edge of the board aims to disrupt white's pawns and perhaps find a way to infiltrate, though it sacrifices considerable central influence for this peripheral ambition. The knight's dance along the light squares, returning to its previous post, suggests a strategic regrouping, aiming to bolster the kingside defense or perhaps prepare a future sortie towards the queenside, all while keeping an eye on the potential for pawn breakthroughs. The knights are dancing a peculiar ballet, oscillating between potential threats and strategic repositioning on the queenside, a quiet positional struggle brewing beneath the surface of the seemingly stagnant position. After a prolonged spell of maneuvering around the knight, This repositioning to C3 hints at a potential shift in white's focus, perhaps aiming to reinforce the central structure or prepare for a more decisive pawn advance like D4, aiming to seize more central space that has been somewhat neglected. The persistent repetition of knight moves, particularly 33, NB6 and now 34, NC6, suggests a deep desire to anchor the knight on a more active square, potentially the D4 outpost, or to shuffle it towards potential tactical skirmishes, but so far it's been a carousel of familiar positions. The bishop's capture on C6 is a strategic maneuver that aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. By eliminating the knight on B6, white gains better control over the c-file and potentially weakens black's queenside defense. This action could pave the way for further pawn advances or the repositioning of white's rooks into more active squares, creating attacking opportunities. It's a decisive step that shifts the game towards a more dynamic middle game, requiring black to carefully assess their counterplay and defensive resources. Reclaiming the pawn and re-establishing pawn harmony on the queenside, this capture aims to solidify black's structure after white's sacrifice. Strategic insight, ***. The piece sacrificed by white on c6 was a gamble to disrupt black's coordination and open lines. Capturing bxc6 is the natural response, but it's crucial to understand the long-term implications. This move repositions the queenside pawns, creating potential weaknesses on the c-file if black isn't careful. However, it also prepares for potential queenside expansion later. The immediate focus shifts to white's initiative and how black can neutralize it. Black's development is a little behind, and the open nature of the position could be exploited by white if black isn't attentive. The key for black now is to consolidate, develop the remaining pieces effectively, and find safe squares for them. This move is part of a broader plan to stabilize and then potentially counterattack. A sensible step to liberate the queen's bishop and establish a foothold on the queenside, though it does create some pawn weaknesses around the king. Re-establishing the knight's central presence on d7 is a shrewd maneuver, aiming to reorganize black's forces after the pawn exchange and the forced simplification on the queenside. This repositioning might be a prelude to a deeper plan, perhaps preparing to contest the e-file or to support a future pawn push, creating dynamic imbalances. Repositioning the knight to the edge of the board, this move signals a shift in white's tactical focus, aiming to pry open the queenside through potential pawn advances and a potential future knight maneuver towards the center or kingside, rather than continuing the sterile repetition of knight sorties. Liberating the knight from its cramped position opens up potential for activity on the queenside, aiming to exploit the recently created pawn weaknesses. Unlocking the d-file now opens critical attacking avenues and threatens to dismantle black's pawn structure, forcing them into a defensive posture, while white consolidates their central control and prepares for a potential pawn push. Re-establishing the bishop's presence on the long diagonal, black aims to activate the piece again, sensing a potential shift in the balance with white's pawn structure now fractured. Reactivating the rook to the open f-file offers a fresh perspective, aiming to disrupt black's now exposed king and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. The king, now venturing from its safe haven, seeks an active role, aiming to become a fighting piece in the impending middle game skirmish. The rook marches forward, aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup by occupying the highly influential 6th rank. This aggressive positioning threatens to split black's pieces and potentially create targets on the kingside, forcing a critical decision on how to parry this intrusion. Relocating the rook from the already fiercely contested central file to the rim is a pragmatic choice, aiming to find safer pastures and potentially support future operations on the queenside, though it does concede some control over the open d-file for the moment. Repositioning the bishop to e3 aims to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for potential pawn pushes or knight maneuvers, while also eyeing the weakened central dark squares after black's recent bishop exchange. Bringing the bishop back to the 3rd rank offers a dual purpose. It bolsters the rook on the d-file by creating a battery, and more importantly, it aims to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside, potentially targeting the b3 pawn and weakening the coordination of white's pieces. Sacrificing the exchange here liberates the white queen and opens a path for the remaining rook to become active, potentially creating threats against the vulnerable black king. Reclaiming the central file opens avenues for counterplay and allows the rook to become an active participant in the defense of the king and potentially join an attack on white's queen side. Re-establishing pressure on the d-file with the rook, preparing to redeploy it to a more active square or support a pawn push. The rook's repositioning to the 5th rank immediately creates significant pressure on the d3 pawn, a potential weak point in white's otherwise solid structure. This energetic deployment forces white to consider defensive measures, potentially diverting resources from offensive plans and allowing black to consolidate their pieces. Reclaiming the central pawn, white boldly snatches a material advantage, disrupting black's nascent attacking setup. Initiating a desperate pawn thrust aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially awaken some counterplay, though it feels more like a last gasp than a calculated plan. Clearing the way for your rook's infiltration by offering a bishop exchange aims to alleviate central pressure and prepare for aggressive kingside operations, potentially exploiting the uncastled king's lingering weakness. Recapturing the pawn with the rook sacrifices a key defender of the kingside, leaving the monarch exposed to potential future attacks. Unleashing a forcing king check, white aims to disrupt black's pieces and exploit the precarious position of the dark-squared bishop now that the g-file is open. The black king, finally emerging from its shell, seeks refuge and potential active participation in the unfolding endgame, attempting to find safety behind the pawn chain after white's aggressive pawn thrust opens up lines. Pivoting the bishop to the queen side offers a renewed perspective, aiming to exploit the now weakened dark squares around black's king and prepare for potential breakthroughs in the central pawn structure. Bishops pair up to harass the exposed enemy monarch, aiming to exploit the king's vulnerable central position after the recent exchange of pieces. Unveiling the king from its protective pawn shield, KH1 sidesteps potential discoverable threats along the back rank and the now somewhat open H-file, a prudent maneuver aiming to secure the monarch before the inevitable exchanges simplify the board further. Exploring a desperate path through the opponent's weakened defenses, the black rook embarks on a daring foray towards the queen side, seeking an elusive outpost or a surprise attack. Sacrificing a piece to unleash the king and force a mating net is a bold gambit, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around the black monarch. Focusing on the immediate defense of the king, this retreat prepares to consolidate the pawn structure after white's aggressive knight sortie. A crucial square now comes under enhanced supervision. The black king, finally liberated from its defensive cage, now ventures into the perilous center of the board, initiating a critical endgame confrontation where piece activity and pawn structure will decide the victor. Puncturing the defensive wall with a regal check demands immediate attention, forcing black's king to a precarious position near the center. The black king, previously quite safe behind its pawns, now finds itself exposed in the center of the board, a prime target for the aggressive white rooks and bishop. Re-establishing dominance on the d-file is paramount. The rook's redeployment there directly challenges black's structural weaknesses and prepares for potential advancements by coordinating with the other rook. Sacrificing the bishop here grants the white king a breathing space from the immediate pressure, but it surrenders crucial defensive potential around black's passed pawn, potentially simplifying white into a winning endgame. The pawn structure is dramatically altered. By capturing with the h-pawn, white solidifies control of the g-file, opening a direct path to the black king's former defenses while creating a passed pawn that might become a nuisance later. The black rook now boldly marches into the enemy camp, aiming to disrupt white's advanced pawn structure and potentially trap the bishop. The knight's journey to e5 creates an immediate threat of checkmate on g6, forcing black's pieces into a defensive posture. Solidifying the central pawn chain, this move aims to create a more stable structure and potentially launch a pawn storm on the queen side or free up the knight for more active deployment. A timely repositioning of the monarch, seeking refuge from the immediate threats and clearing the path for further piece coordination. The rook's relocation to the third rank finally offers a chance for the king to emerge from its defensive shell, preparing to support its isolated pawn and potentially stir up some counterplay on the queen side. Initiating a pawn thrust with the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses in the process. The bishop, liberated from its defensive duties on the king side, now seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queen side or center. Snatching the pawn at c5 is a decisive tactical blow, eliminating a key defender of black's weakened kingside pawn structure and opening lines that can be exploited. A belated attempt to seize initiative on the king side, but the pawn push arrives too late to truly threaten anything substantial. Gaining ground on the queen side, this pawn advance seeks to disrupt black's potential counterplay and create a passed pawn opportunity later. Initiating a desperate pawn push, hoping to create a passed threat or at least distract the white pieces from their more coordinated setup. Carving out space on the queen side with this pawn push aims to restrict black's rook and potential pawn advances. Pushing the pawn adds another dimension to black's counterplay, aiming to outflank the white pieces and potentially open a path for the king to become more active later. Advancing the pawn to a6 offers a subtle but potent positional squeeze, aiming to restrict black's queenside mobility and potentially create an unstoppable passed pawn down the file. Securing the king's retreat to a safer square, freeing the g5 pawn to advance and create a passed threat. The rook's journey to the 7th rank spearheads a decisive pawn race, aiming to promote and shatter black's defensive structure. Pushing the rook to the 7th rank now seems a bit premature, potentially opening a dangerous diagonal for the white king towards that critical central square. Securing the rook on the 2nd rank immediately prepares for the inevitable promotion race, creating a dynamic tension on the queen side. Stepping onto the a8 square is a last-ditch effort to contest the potent open file, but the knight's position on a3 seems to be a strategic dead end, leaving this rook isolated and vulnerable to further incursions along the 7th rank or potential pawn advances. Opening the b-file offers the rooks a new pathway to attack the enemy position. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential begins with pushing it forward, a critical step to threaten the white king's newly acquired space and disrupt the otherwise coordinated pawn chain. Slicing through black's defenses, this pawn push aggressively claims territory on the queen side, preparing to support a potential advance and restrict the opponent's pieces. Suddenly, the pawn's advance forces the king into an even tighter corner, sacrificing itself to create a clear path for its brethren, a desperate attempt to disrupt the overwhelming pawn storm and potentially create counterplay before white's passed kingside pawns become unstoppable. Seeking to untangle the defensive web, the king cautiously advances, aiming to offer support and perhaps even initiate counterplay in the rapidly closing space. Hoping to catch white off guard, the black king ventures forward, creating a dynamic scenario where pawn promotion races will be the primary battlefield. Unleashing a pawn blockade, white attempts to sever the central pawn chain and restrict black's king's mobility, setting the stage for a positional grind where the passed pawn on the queen side becomes a key strategic asset. The king, now a beacon on the open squares, becomes a prime target for black's advanced pawns, a bold gamble to ignite counterplay. Unleashing the pawn's final charge, this advance aims to shatter black's defensive structure and create an unstoppable force towards promotion. A desperate pawn sortie, this checks the king and aims to disrupt white's advancing pawn formation, hoping to create chaos or perhaps a stalemate scenario, though the king has escaped squares. The king, freed from the pawn chain's embrace, ventures forth, seeking sanctuary beyond the encroaching enemy forces, a bold gambit to reignite the dormant counterplay. Unleashing a desperate royal flight, this desperate counterattack forces the white king into a perilous exposed position. Unleashing a final devastating checkmate, white orchestrates a beautiful king hunt, forcing the black monarch into a sacrificial position that seals the game.